King Solomon was the wisest man in history, and while his name does not appear as the author of Ecclesiastes, his fingerprints are all over it. Authors Tiberius Rata and Kevin Roberts join us with a practical exposition of this fascinating book. Welcome to the Harvest Show, guys.
Thank you.
The Book of Ecclesiastes. I mean, I don't hear very many sermons coming from that book. I've read it a couple times, but why the Book of Ecclesiastes?
Well, I think it's very relevant because of its content. We have many Solomons in our lives today. They live trying to fill the void that only God can fill with something else, like Solomon tried.
Okay. Now, when I would expect you to do this book because both of you are professors at Grace College. Kind of give me your credentials.
Well, I teach Hebrew and Old Testament at the Grace College, and I've been doing that since 2005.
And what about you, Kevin?
My doctorate's in clinical psychology, so I teach in the School of Behavioral Sciences.
So how in the world do you two get together on this?
Well, I was teaching a class on Ecclesiastes, and Kevin was sitting in class, and he had certain insights that I thought, that would be good if we write this together. So we rewrote the contract, and we did a book together.
Kevin, one of the things I noticed in looking at the book is filled with not only Tiberius breaking down the analytics of all the verses of Ecclesiastes, but from time to time you'll offer from a psychological standpoint.
Right.
How is Ecclesiastes a psychological or perhaps a behavioral health book?
You know, it really gets at some of our deep longings that we're missing. And it gets at ways we strive towards things that are going to cause damage to us. And it gets at the consequences of our behaviors and how that impacts us as well.
So Tiberius, when you were writing this book, what kind of stood out most in your mind about either King Solomon or just the entire book? Because sometimes when I read about King Solomon, I was like, gosh, for you to be so wise, you did some pretty dumb things. I mean, and that's, you know, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who has come to that conclusion about the wisest man in history. What kind of stood out? What can you tell us about him?
Well, I think the bottom line is this, that apart from a correct relationship with God, everything is meaningless.
Yes.
Solomon tried to find meaning in wine, work, women, and nothing fulfilled because only Christ can fulfill. And that's why it's important to read Ecclesiastes in light of the New Testament. Jesus came to redeem us from the meaninglessness Solomon experienced.
And then, Kevin, what about it being a unique book? Because you say it's the first of its kind. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a practical application. It's an interdisciplinary look. When you're both looking at both not only the scripture, but also what science and some of these things are now adding into the human behavior aspects.
For example?
You know, we look at things like the hedonic treadmill, for example, is one piece of that. It's the pursuit of pleasure. And as you pursue pleasure, the more you go, the further you go with it, you always come back to an original set point. So it doesn't matter if you make above X amount, you're not going to be any happier. And so we saw that lived out in Solomon's life. He was able to build, he was able to build anything. You know, he had so many different construction projects he was involved in, and it didn't matter. None of it satisfied. And he tried so many different things. But you come back to that set point on a level of satisfaction.
Okay, so kind of look at something in current and modern day history and kind of compare that to what you saw as you were writing Ecclesiastes, because I want people to get a practical look at it. Like I said, I haven't heard very many sermons from this book. So kind of break it down for the average Joe.
I would say that a big part of this book, really, we try to get at practical applications of how your emotions and how our memories work and how we retain things. You know, and Solomon at the end of the book really emphasized, remember God. You know, you have to do this throughout your life. And towards the end of the book, we really get at him wrestling with fear God. You know, keep his commandments and follow him throughout, because he didn't live a life that way. And we see that as throughout the book, we talk about how to view work and how to view some of those other aspects.
Tiberius, you made the comment earlier, there are a lot of Solomons still today. begging to differ, but when we look at our political scene today, I think a lot of people say, well, where are they? and maybe they aren't in politics, but where do you see these Solomons, and how are they applying the lessons that you're teaching?
What I meant is these Solomons know who God is. Solomon was not an atheist. God appeared to him twice. But he systematically and consistently disobeyed God and chose not to obey his law. And that's why there was this void in his life that he tried to fill with other things.
I see.
And the question is then, even for the believer today, can we quote the book of Ecclesiastes and say everything is meaningless? And the answer is no, because again, Jesus said, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. That's the motto of the Christian, the one who obeys God and follows God. We are to live a full, meaningful, and abundant life.
When we look at King Solomon, kind of take us back and give us his backstory, because what he's probably most known for was the decision that he made about the baby. Kind of talk about the earlier years in his life.
Yeah, so after he prayed for God to give him wisdom, a decision that God liked, he said, I'm going to give you not just wisdom, I'm going to give you riches and the defeat of your enemies because you have not asked for it. And then that test that comes right after that with the baby is his first test that the people see, oh, okay, he's got God-given wisdom. And you can see that all throughout the first part of his life in 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11. But in 11, it says God was angry with Solomon because he decided to go against his will and to marry all these foreign women who led him astray from God.
Kevin, you know, the book of Ecclesiastes has been there for years. The New Testament has been, all these lessons are there. Why don't people learn, even people who consider themselves good Christians,
right?
Why don't they learn these and put them into practice?
You know, I think our tendency is to look around our world and look for things that are immediate to satisfy our longings. And we look for things that will give us this temporary satisfaction. And we don't want to wait for God. We sometimes don't want to pour out our heart before God. And if we can get something that gives us that momentary satisfaction, we'll take it. And ultimately, that's the unfortunate part. That immediate satisfaction only leads us down a road that is going to lead towards meaninglessness and sadness, depression, so many other behaviors.
So the book is called Fear God and Keep His Commandments. I know you two are professors, but how should we approach reading this project? Is it for a pastor to preach from the pulpit, or can it be used for Bible studies?
Oh, no doubt, and that's the way it's broken down. Each chapter is broken down. It's very preachable, teachable in 2, 3, or 4 points. And it's been written exactly so that a layperson can read, a pastor, a student of the Bible can read it. And it's important to make it to the end of the book. Remember your Creator, and he concludes well, fear God and keep His commandments. He doesn't say that because he did it, but he basically says, learn from my mistakes. And sometimes wise people today will learn from other people's successes and their mistakes.
How do we get wisdom? How do we get it? Do we do what Solomon did? I mean, he asked God for wisdom. Today in our everyday lives, how can we get it? The same way?
Yeah, and I think it's throughout your lifespan, all the decisions you make, and those small details. Am I purposeful? Is my purpose for my own glory or for God's? And when we live in light of that, what we strive after becomes very different. And wisdom is something that happens with time. We have biological evidence to say that people who pray on a regular basis actually change the frontal lobe of their brain. And they thicken it. Well, that's your impulse control. That's your executive functioning for your brain. You actually make yourself better able to pause and reflect and maybe not make that wrong decision.
Wow, you just taught me something there. I'm going to do it more often. Tiberius and Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today on The Harvest Show. To connect with Professors Rata and Roberts, go to online.grace.edu, or you know the drill, go to harvest-tv.com for a link to their new project. It's called Fear God and Keep His Commandments. Coming up later, Brian Bush with today's Holy Land Moment, but up next, Pastor Mark Lance. We'll be right back.